So good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to be here. As Adrian said, my name is Chuck Davis. I have the honor and pleasure of serving Mary Baldwin as the Vice President for University Advancement. And in the script here, which has been very carefully orchestrated, it says, introduce yourself and offer any brief personal remarks. So I'm going to take that opportunity to say two things. One is to thank each of you that make a gift to your alma mater every year. I had the opportunity to speak with Jeannie yesterday afternoon at the Grafton Society luncheon, and we're grateful for her philanthropic support of her alma mater. We were talking about that experience for her as a donor, and she was comparing, if I may, the experience she had after having made a nice gift to Mary Baldwin and the experience her husband had after making a gift to his alma mater. And it warmed my heart to hear her talk about effusively the thanks and the gratitude that she received from Mary Baldwin. And it makes me understand and it makes me think, and I want you all to understand too, in a very intimate way, that every single gift that is made to this institution has an impact on students, on program, and on place. It is so important, and we are so grateful to each of you who choose to invest in this really special place. The second thing I'm going to offer as I prepare to introduce our keynote speaker, as Dr. Fox often says, and I completely concur, the story of this institution, I think increasingly, is going to be told through the lens and the voice of those people who chose to study here over the decades. The lives that you each lead and the circles in which you run really are reflective of the education that is offered here today. It's reflected in the faces of the students in Carpenter Hall, the students who are on the stage, the students that Dr. Fox just mentioned who are on the playing field. That the values and the joy that emulates from all of those young people really is reflective of the people in the room today. And it's just very, very important. We're grateful for you to be connected with us. And as Dr. Fox said, we'll look forward to looking for more creative ways to do just that over the coming months. But speaking of lens and speaking of alumni voices, what a joy it is for me to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dacrie Brooks, from the class of 1998. We've known about Dacrie for a long time, but we had an additional kind of alert on her when she assumed a new position as the Director of Communications for the Marshall Project in San Antonio, Texas. And we started sniffing a little bit more intentionally about Dacrie and her really illustrious career, which began in New York City as a senior media relations executive. She has more than 20 years of experience and specializes in dynamic and memorable storytelling to help companies increase brand visibility and market share. She has secured countless business articles for her clients in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and Time Magazine. One of her career highlights was securing a cover story for one of her clients in Forbes magazine. She's a writer, a speaker, a trainer, and a coach, and has a passion for building authentic relationships and teaching women how to overcome negative self-talk. As a first-generation college student here at Mary Baldwin, Dacrie not only earned a bachelor's degree in mass communication, but she was highly engaged as a student, just like many of you were as well. She worked in the Office of External Relations as a student staff writer, and she worked very closely on the student newspaper. We'd like to think that Mary Baldwin was completely responsible for her launch into her career, as her first publication was our very own Mary Baldwin magazine. And she had the unique experience of contributing to then President Tyson's commencement address when she matriculated for Mary Baldwin in 1998. Dacrie is deeply passionate about socioeconomic and racial justice issues, and you'll hear from her today some of the stories that reflect that passion. She believes, like many of us do, adversity builds character, and she loves to quote her favorite poet, Maya Angelou, quote, "Her mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style." I think that's a wonderful quote. Dacrie has been saving up her travel time and resources to see her eldest daughter graduate this year, but we're just delighted that she agreed to join us virtually from her home office in San Antonio. So please join me in giving a hearty and warm welcome to Dacrie Brooks, class of 1998.
Thank you so much, Chuck. What an introduction. I am so honored to be with you today, even virtually. I remember when I first learned about Mary Baldwin, I'm going to take you back so many years ago. I remember the brochure coming in the mail and it sat there in the corner of the dining room table at my mom's house for about a week, along with other pieces of papers and bills before I decided to open it up and flip through the pages. To be 100% transparent, for a myriad of reasons, I really wanted to be in New York. And as Chuck mentioned, that's where I started my career. But I also wanted to go to school in New York, but my mom insisted I stay in Virginia. So I kind of lost that battle. And a month later, I remember being in Hunt Dining Hall listening to young college students share their experiences about Apple Day, their small class sizes, and the majestic beauty of the campus in the fall. And so I remember on the car ride home, my mom and I kind of struck up this deal. It was really a compromise. It was if I decided to attend Mary Baldwin and I didn't love it after a couple of years, I could transfer to any school I wanted. So reluctantly, I agreed. But I did have a plan in my mind at that point. I would stick it out for a couple of years, transfer, and possibly earn my degree somewhere in New York like I had planned, and I would start my life. But after meeting with college advisors, I got special permission to bulk up my course load. I remember I would call my mom frantic saying, why did I do this? But I really wanted to prepare myself for a future in communications. So as Chuck mentioned, I interned at the Central Communications Office, where I drafted press releases and I wrote news articles, and I remember tracking media clips. Back then it was scissors and newspaper. And while I was at school, I applied for scholarships to help me pay for my education and during the summer. So I remember interning at the Freelance Star, a small paper in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I covered everything from local news to town fairs to even writing obits. I really enjoyed the change of seasons in Virginia and walking around covering news stories. So that was during the summer. I don't know, as Chuck mentioned, I'm here in San Antonio, so summers are brutal here. So I really do miss that. But when I returned back to Mary Baldwin my sophomore year, I ultimately decided to stay. And I guess you could say it was the hills, it was the class sizes, the school activities, all of that had grown on me. I remember one of my favorite professors, Dr. Garrison, who taught English. He was precarious, he was demanding, sometimes he was grumpy. But he was really always willing to engage in dialogue with his students. In my classes, I felt seen, I felt heard, I knew everyone. And as a young adult, that really helped me because I learned how to enter into discussions with people who came from different backgrounds. One of my hallmates had parents who sent her packages in cash every couple of weeks, and another one of my friends drove her freshman year of school. She had her own car, and I hadn't experienced any of that. So it was very interesting. I remember feeling a little perplexed as I rubbed up against privilege. I felt straddled even attending Mary Baldwin, between poverty and privilege, because I did not come from that type of background. I really did depend on my internship and scholarship checks to get me through, to pay for laundry, to pay for gas when I finally did get a car my sophomore year. And I worked hard to really grow myself as an independent thinker, writer, and communicator. And I definitely have Mary Baldwin to thank for that. I remember if I had a question in class or if I raised my hand, if I didn't even agree with someone, I still spoke up. and that was encouraged. And if I had a story, I told it. I think really this is when I learned about the power of storytelling and just how important it is that we learn about ourselves and each other through the stories we share. So my thoughts and opinions weren't always welcomed, right? But people listened to my perspective. And during my time at Mary Baldwin, which seems like decades ago, we were an all women's college at that point. And so I found myself relating to many of my classmates when we would talk about women's equality and rights. And yet I would still share the nuance and implications of being a young Black woman in that space at that time. During that time, Mary Baldwin was beginning to make some major cultural shifts in the demographic makeup of their faculty and student body. Although I was just one of a few Black students on campus, I could see the potential of diversity, and that excited me. Mary Baldwin had become more intentional about bringing people to the campus who were from various backgrounds. And many of us Black students pushed for it. A small group started, I think it was called the Umoja Club. And around the same time, Mary Baldwin hired Dr. Scott and opened the new Office of African American Affairs. This doesn't mean everything ran smoothly, right? But it did give me hope, and I wanted to stick it out until the very end. So ultimately, I let go of my elaborate plan to transfer, and I decided to finish out my time and earn my communications degree at Mary Baldwin. Because I've been so set on leaving, what I really had done was set myself up ahead of my class. So just an interesting tidbit, I graduated in the class of 1998, but I enrolled and had started my freshman year in 1995, which means I graduated 3 years early. I'm sorry, 1 year early. I graduated in 3 years. So, okay, so here we are. I like humor, all right? So I would love for y'all to humor me because I want to take you back. And so for laughs and giggles, and you'll see this, I kind of flip around the way I speak, but I had to go back down memory lane. I wanted to know, where was I and what was happening in 1998? So just to light it up, in no particular order, I'm going to take you on a trip back with me to 1998. So these are things I Googled, fun facts, right? Okay, so in 1998, Lauryn Hill's album, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, was released. She won a Grammy as a new artist. She is one of my favorite artists. That is one of my favorite albums. And I'm proud to say that each one of my 3 kids know all the words to at least one Lauryn Hill song. Okay, second fun fact, 1998, Bill Clinton said he had no sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky, right? Doesn't that seem like such a long time ago? And number 3, I would love for you, if you're in the room, raise your hand. I can't see you, but I'm going to trust that you're doing this. If you have an Apple product, so raise your hands. I'm on okay, great. I get to see you. Awesome. So Apple unveiled the iMac in 1998. It was like this small box. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, I thought it was the weirdest thing why a computer company would be named after a fruit. And here we are, we live on our phones. So 1998, this was the monumental year for me. Not only was it the year that I graduated, but it's also the year that I became a mom. I was scared, excited, confused, and only 22 years old. And yet, because of what I learned about myself during my time at Mary Baldwin, I knew I'd be okay. That doesn't erase my fair share of bumps, because I've had them, abysmal failures, setbacks, and triumphs, but I would not trade it for anything in the world. So as I sit here in front of you, instead of speaking in quotes and mantras and paraphrasing some of the greats, I'm exploring the power of storytelling while sharing a few lessons that I've learned along the way. And I hope that you can grab one of these, all of them, and I'm sure that you could relate. So the first one that I have is to stay curious. Curiosity is the key to learning. Curiosity opens up our minds, it opens up our hearts, and it allows us to think more deeply about ourselves and in each other. And, you know, as Adrienne mentioned, we are in a time where our hearts need to remain open. At Mary Baldwin, we were engaged in hard conversations. This was in 1998, and here we are in 2022, a time where we need to get back to having those hard conversations. Not only do we need to lean into being curious, but we have to remind ourselves that being curious is a part of self-reflection and growth. After years of therapy, I've learned that sitting in the discomfort of questioning and poking isn't a bad thing. It's a necessary thing, especially for my own personal mental health and well-being. The second lesson that I've learned is about the power of being spontaneous. You know, the word spontaneous is typically equated with being impulsive, uninhibited, reckless, naive, and carefree. And while some of that may hold true, I want to invite us to consider all the ways in which some of our biggest lessons and best experiences have come from a place of being spontaneous and making quick decisions. Let me give you an example. One morning, I woke up and decided that I no longer wanted to live in Virginia. I wanted to live in New York City, and I wanted to work in Manhattan. I first fell in love with the Big Apple at the age of 15 when I visited while I was in high school. And I remember fantasizing about becoming this like high paid corporate executive working on Wall Street. Sounds weird, right? Like now it sounds very weird because there's no part of me that I think is really corporate, but I had this vision. So I woke up one morning and I said, I'm going to move to New York. And I gave myself 2 weeks to find a job and an apartment. I got the job first because finding an apartment in New York is so hard. But when I got back to Virginia, after finding my apartment and my job, I packed up my belongings and I moved to New York. I started, as Chuck mentioned, working at a public relations firm on Madison Avenue, quickly worked my way up to a senior media relations specialist. And ironically, even though I'm here in San Antonio, my life has made a full circle back to New York. The Marshall Project is based in New York. I'm a remote worker, and I love that, but it does feel very full circle to me. The third piece is creating a community, creating community. You know, we're not meant to do this thing called life in a bubble. We're not meant to do it alone. We all know this. But I can't tell you how I'm still trying to adjust from being in isolation for the last 2 years. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it should be that we all need each other. Did anyone have a virtual happy hour during the pandemic? Was it weird? Yeah, raise your hand. Who had virtual happy hours? Okay, great. I see some hands in the audience. Thank you. Here's the thing. We're still so caught up in ourselves and our daily lives and the things we need to do. We need not to stop that, right? We need not stop phoning a friend, having happy hours, having virtual happy hours, because we need to stay in community. I know I haven't joined anything recently. I think about it a lot. I tell my kids about it, but I'm constantly working to make sure that I'm reaching out and building community with other people. As parents, that's what we do for our kids. We put them in tons of activities. Why do we do that? We know that we do that because we want them to have support systems, ways to deal with the daily stressors of life. So I guess what I'm saying is that when you're part of a community, you're also able to realize that you're not on an island. You're not the only one who may feel overwhelmed. You are in fact human. The fourth piece of advice that I have, and this is part of my story, is that you can't play it safe. Life is really too short not to take chances. As I've gotten older, I've had to constantly remind myself that my age doesn't define my capacity to change, to do things differently, to pursue new passions, to explore new opportunities, and to even change my mind. I've been socially conditioned, like many of us, to believe that the older I've become, the more set in my ways I have to be. And while that's true, that's also simply not the case. I'm learning that life is about not just turning new pages, but starting new chapters. Sometimes it's about throwing away the book and writing a new one. It's okay to change your career path, to walk away from something that no longer serves you. Growth isn't a perfect square, nor is it a linear process. And if you're a recent graduating age 15 or age 55, there should be a lesson in there somewhere for you. So what is something that you're sitting on because you're afraid? Are you listening to everyone else tell you what and who they think you should be? Or are you tapping into yourself and taking a risk as you work toward finding your own inner compass? And it's so interesting because as I'm asking the audience these questions, as I'm asking you these questions, I'm also continuing to ask myself those very same questions. And last but not least is be vulnerable. If you're not allowing yourself to be vulnerable, you're slowly slicing off pieces of your own humanity. I've always thought that I had to have it all together. That struggle for perfectionism is real. And for women, it's such a heavy burden. I can't see all of you, but I want you to look at each other and raise your hands if you've ever heard these, okay? So look at each other, turn and look at each other and raise your hand, okay, if you've ever said this. Big girls don't cry, or if you've ever heard these. Strong women are successful. Who's heard that one? Okay. Never let them see you sweat. Isn't that a commercial? Right? And here's the one that I'm sure I'll see everybody's hand. Fake it till you make it. Who's heard that one? Let me see those hands. Okay. I'm not saying that these are terrible, y'all. But what I do want us to consider is that we have been programmed to not show our emotions. When we put up these walls, we create barriers for true connectedness. In the last few years, my vulnerability has become the source of my strength, my healing, and most importantly, my joy. And I've also had to work on my listening skills, seeking to understand versus being quick to respond. When we're truly listening, our hearts are open. And the last thing is, I know I said the last thing, but I have to camp out here for a second. It's about sharing your story. So my willingness to open up myself to others, not just the joy, but also the pieces of my pain, brings me to who I am right now as a writer, a communicator, a spoken word artist, an activist, Black, queer, complicated, hard, soft, curious, open, human. I am a storyteller, and so are you. To be a good storyteller, you don't have to be seated at a campfire sharing a spooky tale in front of roasted marshmallows. We're all storytellers. We all have memories in our minds just waiting to come out and to connect with someone. Stories make up our lives. Stories are how we remember people. Stories don't make us feel so alone when we share them with others. Stories build connections. We use stories to drive change, to elicit compassion and build empathy. They're a way to show reverence, honor, and respect. I have a special story here. I'm throwing this in just because it's hitting my heart right now. My sophomore year, I think it was my third day in school at Mary Baldwin, and I'm not a huge school skipper, never have been, but that day there was just something really odd that was in my spirit, and so I just didn't go to class. I remember around 6 o'clock at night, I got a phone call from my mom saying that my grandmother had just passed away earlier that afternoon. I was devastated. My grandmother's birthday is the day before mine. We always celebrated together. She was super proud of me for going to Mary Baldwin, and had come to see me in campus the year before. And so when I found out she passed away, I, of course, went home, came back a week later. And I remember walking to the student center, I believe, to check my mailbox. And as soon as I checked my mail, I had a letter from my grandmother wishing me a good week of school, saying how proud of me she was, how she loved Mary Baldwin, and she thought that it was great that I was attending school, and that she just wanted to wish me well wishes for that first week of school, my sophomore year. And that sustained me. That letter sustained me. And I remember just having a wonderful experience with students and faculty sending me flowers, checking in on me just to make sure that I was okay. And so that's one of the stories that touched my heart and one of the fondest memories I have of Mary Baldwin. So our stories do leave legacies, and they follow us well beyond our time, right? So I'm taking you back to what I think that was 1999 that happened. And I just tear up a little bit because I remember my grandmother, and that's a way to keep her alive. You can also ask my 13-year-old Dylan. She's wonderful. She has only seen her great-grandfather in pictures, but our story, my dad's story in particular, of telling Dylan this story, has the ability to bring him alive, right? With the recalling of this single story. She's heard it time and time again. You know, she's heard 6-year-old me sitting on Pawpaw's lap, sporting 2 fuzzy sandy brown pigtails, framed up with a white bow, overtaken by my grin that was so tight and so long that it could snap a rubber band. You know, what 6-year-old wouldn't be excited about saying ice cream instead of cheese, knowing that I would get 2 huge heapings of vanilla bean sweetness waiting for me right around the corner. So I had a huge smile. That was how I was coerced into taking the pick. But Dylan loves that story, and we both do. And as we age, hopefully we're going to continue to share stories, and hopefully Dylan will have short stories to tell too. So I'm at this age now where I guess it's kind of like a tipping point, where I realized that to bring my whole self means to bring my totality of my identity to everything I do. And, you know, Chuck mentioned that I'm very passionate about equity and race and social justice. And so that brings me to where I am now, which is at the Marshall Project. So as a communications director, I've done a lot in terms of really learning about the criminal justice system. I first found out about this job when one of my former colleagues, Maria, sent me a direct message on LinkedIn. Her note said, "Interesting, and something more with a journalism angle. You could totally do this." So I applied. Several interviews and writing assessments later, I landed the job. So named after Thurgood Marshall, the Marshall Project, let me just tell you what it is it's a nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom focused on criminal justice. The Marshall Project covers hard-hitting issues such as the death penalty, immigration, and policing. In my role, I lead our public affairs work, and I work closely with some award-winning journalists to ensure that their stories are getting out into the mainstream. One of the best parts of my job is that I get to share this story with you. So what I'm going to do right now is hopefully you'll all be able to see this, but I'm going to share my screen. Can y'all all see this? Yeah? Okay, so let's see if I can bring it out.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, good. Awesome. So this is a story that I'm going to share, and this is a story that really hits me. It's one of several, many that the Marshall Project has done. A few months ago, the Marshall Project wrote a story in partnership with ProPublica and NBC News And it went inside one of Louisiana's harshest juvenile lockups. It's called the Acadiana Center for Youth at St. Martinville, Louisiana. And this facility opened up last year with pretty much no acknowledgement from state officials. One expert called it child abuse. So what happened with this story in particular is that you had parents who had been in contact with their kids, anywhere ages from 14 on up. And one mom in particular couldn't find her son, and she found out through an attorney several weeks later that he had been transferred to this facility in St. Martinville. And so these kids were shackled. They were in iron cuffs. They were held in solitary confinement anywhere from 23 hours for the day. They had no access to mental health services, no access to education. And this center, as well as many juvenile centers throughout the country, are supposed to be to rehabilitate and provide mental health services to kids so that they are able to come out of that situation and be in society. And that didn't happen. So like, if you look at some of the pictures here, you could see holes in the walls from some of the kids that had dug holes because of the fact that they were just scared and incarcerated pretty much. So the reason why I'm sharing this story, and if you could see in the little box, Beth Schwartzbaffel is the reporter at the Marshall Project who wrote this story, and she interviewed a detainee by the name of Ben. I think Ben was 15 years old, and she was asking him if he had access to school. And he told her no, he had no access to school. He had no access to books. Literally, the only time he got out of his room is when he would use the restroom. And so the reason why I love this story, even though it's so hard hitting, is because the Marshall Project's, this story in particular, impacted state lawmakers. So what happened was, as a result of this story, there was an investigation with 2 committee hearings and gut-wrenching testimonies about solitary confinement in the youth justice system. One person who testified said he said, quote, "I lost part of who I was as a human being. My need to feel loved, my need to feel in control of my life." So after this particular hearing, lawmakers quickly advanced a new bill, and they are placing strict limits on the hours in which a youth can be held in solitary confinement for children in Louisiana. One of the things about this story is that the rapper T.I. Harris also created a 1-minute video with his social justice group calling on Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards to shut the center down. In this video, he urged people to contact the governor's office, the Louisiana governor's office, and a lot of local groups came together to report statements out to local media and policymakers. This also had a huge effect in terms of stinging editorials. There were people, the Advocate, which is one of the newspapers in Louisiana, had its own request asking for state records. They actually did a follow-up story to the investigation. NBC News on their streaming service did one. And so this story is one of many stories about the criminal justice system. And if you haven't heard of the Marshall Project, you definitely want to go to the marshallproject.org to follow some of the news. I know that in the few months that I've been working for the Marshall Project, I have learned so much about the criminal justice system and just the ways in which it works across the board. And I do have one more lingering thought as I start to close this up, and we can open it up for questions. But I just want to make sure that I reiterate here that you do not have to work for a nonprofit, be a writer, or feel like you don't have something important to say to share a story. I just want to encourage you that like everyone has a story, everyone has a voice. And there's always someone who needs to hear your story, who's waiting for the story to come out of your mouth or to be able to read your story. So I just want to say thank you to my Mary Baldwin family. It has been a true honor sharing this time with you. I am so excited to be able to just sit here and talk to you and give you a little bit about what I do. And I want to thank you for inviting me to speak.
Dacrie, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your story and reminding us that we are all indeed storytellers of our own, and also have sort of an obligation to tell the stories of others who maybe don't have voices or spaces to do that in. So thank you so much. So we're running a little short on time, but we do have time for 1 to 2 questions. So if you have a question for Dacrie, please feel free, if you're in the room, to raise your hand, or if you're joining us online, just please pop that into the Q&A. And we would love to just take any questions while we have Dacrie with us right now. All right, we've got one at the back of the room.
Who was your biggest influence here at Mary Baldwin? Like if a specific professor or advisor or staff member?
Yeah, I mean, there are two. I think Dr. Garrison was my first one. He was my English teacher, I think freshman year, and he just really challenged me. And he called on everyone and encouraged everyone to speak. And I love those types of professors where they don't let anyone in the room stay silent. So I think he really was a huge impact on me because everyone had a voice, and I think he showed that. The second professor was Dr. Robert Reich. He's one of my communications professors. He was just so funny. He kept class engaging. I love humor and I love, connecting with people. And so I just loved his classes. He was a character.
Well, we've got one more in the center of the room here.
So I think you stated that you were here when, it's currently known as the Office of Inclusive Excellence, like when it was being created. Did you participate in the forming of any of like the minority clubs on campus? And if so, like what impact did that help you with in your professional development?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I was part of the Umoja Club for a hot minute. I had a huge course load, so I graduated in 3 years. So I stayed more on the communication side, but I also would pitch in to promote speakers. I remember one of our speakers was Dr. Ayanna Van Zandt. This was at a time when most people really didn't know who she was. She was just starting her career. And so I remember, writing copy for a flyer and posting it on walls and in the student center. And that was a lot of fun.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I know that we're running short on time and need to close us out before we move to our back to class sessions. But would you all please join me in saying a huge thank you to Dacrie for being with us.
Thank you, everyone.
And I will say that if you did not get a chance to have your burning question answered, you may let us know as you leave, and we will be happy to email those to Dacrie and put her in touch with you. She's a marvelous human being, and we, again, just thank you so much. And I'd now like to turn it over to my fabulous colleague, Ann Hall.